Excellenz.
Excellency, Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Ardern, we would like to welcome you and your delegation most cordially. We are grateful to have you here all the way from New Zealand. Welcome once again in this big conference hall. And thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. We're happy to have you. I would like to welcome the Excellency of New Zealand to Germany and many other excellencies from many other countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very delighted to have you here. Thank you for being our guests at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. It is a great honor to us to welcome so many guests this afternoon. We have the General Secretary of the Social Democratic Party of Germany here with us, who is also a member of Parliament, Lars Klingbeil, who's a person that will enter into a discussion with the Honourable Prime Minister of New Zealand. Lars, thank you for being here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Prime Minister is here on an official visit. She's not only to visit Germany, but also a host of many other countries of Europe. Today, the Prime Minister of New Zealand is with us. And to us, as an organization which is devoted to social democracy in the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, this is of utmost significance and of an outstanding importance. I told the Prime Minister in the run-up to the discussion, I said that very few guests that we were able to welcome at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation were that interested and had such a positive reporting in the press even prior to her arrival, as was the case with you, Jacinda. And there is a very good reason for that. You got a very good feedback in the press, you as a person and also within your particular position. And with your country, we raise a lot of hopes. We do hope that apart from all the very important economic matters, new inspiration will be provided to us for domestic developments of the respective countries. Economic success is just one thing, but it needs to be combined with social justice, economic success, and ecological responsibility. This is something that we were informed about concerning your government program, and it's been far beyond the borders of New Zealand and inspired us significantly, and this is why we're really looking forward to your presentation. You, Honourable Prime Minister, have made a lot of intriguing statements on all these different topics. And this really strengthens us in our aspiration in order to contribute to the developments in these policy areas. You have given a priority to climate change in your country, and that to us is very well understandable, but you also set a moral model for the policy realms in other parts of the world, especially and in particular for an industrialized nation such as the Federal Republic of Germany. You very explicitly made this point in all the publications that I mentioned before, including the press. You also fight for a fair and just exchange of goods between different nations, and this really is inspiring to us because we want to join forces in order to fight against protectionism and isolation. But we want to engage in fair competition and fair trade, respecting and considering each other's interests, but also respecting and considering the interests of those countries that require our utmost solidarity, because they have a lot of catching up to do. And because if we want to act in solidarity and based on the principle of equality across the continents, we need to take on responsibility for all these developments, be it in Asia, in South America, or be it in Africa. all the people of the world need to be supported because we also have to take care of them. You have embarked on a very particular approach with regards to these matters, and this is why I'm really looking forward to your presentation. You, Honourable Prime Minister, combine this with a very impressive and nice way of presenting yourself. You're very kind, and this is why I think your political strategies will be particularly successful, and this is why you also play a role model for us. We're very happy and we feel very honored to have you here. Let me welcome you once again most cordially, and now we are looking forward to your presentation.
Guten Tag, and can I say kia ora koutou katoa, as I would greet you in New Zealand. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm especially grateful to be hosted by FES. Can I acknowledge the Deputy Secretary of the SPD and others here, some in the room who I recognise. Hello, my old friend Franz. It's wonderful, a really wonderful opportunity to be here. Some of you may well know that some years ago I was the President of the International Union of Socialist Youth. It was a role that gave me an insight into many, many things. My poor command of other languages was one. In fact, if you asked any of my multilingual board members at the time, they would have told you that based on my accent, they weren't entirely convinced I even spoke English. But I also developed a huge appreciation for the many globally focused think tanks within Europe. And I acknowledge the very special role that FES has played for a number of years.
Immer mehr Menschen fliehen vor dem Krieg nach Europa.
Das eigentliche Ziel der Flüchtlinge heißt Deutschland.
Menschen sind hergekommen und hatten im Grunde genommen nichts.
Willkommenskultur.
Die Hilfsbereitschaft für die Menschen ist groß.
Es sind bewegende Szenen an Bahnhöfen.
Viele von ihnen begrüßen die Flüchtlinge mit Beifall.
Wir haben so vieles geschafft.
And we are very envious of that. I also do want to acknowledge your Chancellor. In a changing international environment, it is imperative that we strengthen ties and relationships with countries who share similar values. I know I am one of many who is grateful for your nation's much-needed leadership at a time when international systems have come under significant strain. As countries, not only do we share values, we share similarities in our political system. Our election was held in September last year, and in the aftermath, we faced considerable pressure to speed up our coalition negotiations. In fact, there was a reasonable amount of frustration over the time it took for us to conclude our negotiation, produce and sign our coalition and our confidence and supply agreements. It took a grand total of 15 days. Even if our talks were comparatively short, I have an appreciation for the complexity of such negotiations, whether in your country or mine, not just because of the public pressure that surrounds them, but for the internal party political matters that must be factored in too. It's not easy because compromise is not easy.
What was the key difference between the National and the Labour offers that made it for you?
Well, I can't talk for all of my caucus colleagues. You can only try and summate or précis what their comments would have been. But all around the country, people felt that we could and should be doing far better, that there are far too many people living in degraded and poor circumstances in this country, and that too many people in the power structure of New Zealand are simply out of touch. That was the biggest thing that changed, I think, my caucus, and by the looks of it, my board as well.
What changes do you expect in housing?
Well, first of all, I'd expect there to be fewer people coming here so that we can begin to handle the demand side, and that we start building 10,000 affordable homes per year. And affordable homes is what we're talking about, which we clarified in the negotiations, that New Zealanders can hope to get on the rung of home ownership as first homeowners.
Nor is maintaining distinct party identities while also building consensus on issues as a government. Now, I am in no position to share any particular insights, especially in a country that has operated under this system of governance for longer than ours. But I can at least say that in New Zealand, I am focused on demonstrating that coalition governments can champion both consensus and diverse views for the national good. Wish me luck. But for today, my mind is focused squarely on issues that are dominating the international agenda and have done so for some time. Whatever the news headline, the underlying theme in global politics seems to be the same, that the rules have changed, economically and politically. For those of us who identify ourselves as being part of the progressive movement, there is no question that this unsettled environment has led to challenging questions from the public and voters, and challenging political outcomes in debates, elections, and referenda. This is not new. A decade ago, as the president of the International Union of Socialist Youth, I visited the United Nations in New York for a gathering of the Socialist International. Present were leaders like Georgios Papandreou, who at the time was leader of the opposition, and Joseph Stiglitz. We were there to discuss the emerging financial crisis. At the time, we were staring down the barrel of a hugely unsettled period for countries and their citizens, and there was a rallying cry for progressive nations and their governments to respond. Some would argue that that response never came. More than a decade later, we continue to face the challenges of what I would characterize as a sense of global uncertainty. Globalization, of course, isn't new. In New Zealand, we have grappled with this issue and its impact for decades, but the sense of insecurity seems to have only strengthened over the years. The benefits from globalization have been distributed disproportionately to the few. There is a growing sense that ordinary people are working harder just to stay in exactly the same place. Add to that rapid technological change, where even in a country as small as New Zealand, the workforce faces the prospect that more than 45% of jobs will no longer exist or will be completely replaced in just 2 decades, and it is little wonder that that sense of insecurity has grown. Now, as politicians, we have choices in how we respond to this growing but justifiable dissatisfaction. We can offer a message of hope, or we can offer a message of fear. People need security. They need to hear from their political leaders that we anticipate that change, that we have a plan, that we understand their need for job security, that we understand their need for housing security, and that we understand the need for hope for the next generation so that they too can have the future that their parents had, if not a better one. And if we do none of these things, we leave a vacuum for fear and for populism. Now, the challenge for progressive and inclusive movements, from my perspective, lies in delivering that sense of security whilst also staying true to the notion of open borders, fair trade, international responsibility, and other principles that have guided a country like New Zealand for a number of years. In New Zealand, I believe we are starting to meet that challenge. But what does all of this add up to? In essence, it's our own formula to meet the challenges that we face by unapologetically putting the well-being of people and the well-being of our environment at the centre of what we do. Connectedness, inclusion, and the principles of kindness in the way we govern is how we choose to meet the challenge of global uncertainty. And yes, I use the word kindness a lot in New Zealand.
So, Prime Minister, dear Jacinda, thanks a lot for the impressing, for the positive speech, for all your thoughts. And I'm very honored to be with you together here on the panel and have a discussion. So my time in UC ended 2 years before you came president. That's one of the moments I'm feeling like a very old man. So we have a short Q&A. We have some questions reach us by Twitter, by social networks. But first of all, I quickly want to comment on 2 points and want to give you on the first 2 questions.
On climate change and young people entering into politics because of it. Again, where I see there being overlap, it's about having that plan. Last week in New Zealand, we announced that we will not be issuing any more offshore oil and gas exploration permits in New Zealand. Now, that was a significant move on our part, but it was an acknowledgement that if we don't make that decision today, I'll be postponing it for a leader who will be in place when I'm long gone in politics, having a lovely time somewhere in the Mediterranean. But who does that benefit and who does it harm? Well, it harms those industries and those regions, because it's regions in New Zealand are heavily reliant on those sources of income. By saying to them now, we're not going to undercut the permits that are out there already. There are over 50 in New Zealand. There will be drilling for oil and gas in our country for some time to come. But unless we draw a line in the sand, I would be leaving those regions high and dry in the future. And I wouldn't be sending a clear signal to the market that we have to start investing in alternatives to fossil fuels. So for me, the ultimate principle, we have to have a plan, and we have to demonstrate to the public we have a plan.
Thanks a lot. You mentioned housing. There's also a question on Twitter about rents and housing prices. They are skyrocketing not only in Berlin but also in New Zealand. How do you deal with the issue of affordable housing in New Zealand?
And these, as they would be in Berlin, I imagine these are complex issues for us. If there was only one thing that was contributing to the problem, it would have been solved a long time ago. We at least acknowledged that it had reached crisis point, and it has. In New Zealand, you'll pay on average New Zealand dollars over $1 million for a very standard house in Auckland. We have some of the lowest home ownership rates we've had in over 50 years. For Indigenous New Zealanders, home ownership sits at 29%. And those, for us, are staggering statistics that say we are losing that Kiwi dream that we have, that you can own your own home and you can secure your future. And the knock-on effect is, means that our universal pension regime is inadequate if you rent a home in your old age. So there's a number of reasons why socially this mattered to us, why it created fractured communities and why we wanted, and transient communities, because we don't have a culture of renting long-term in New Zealand. If you rent, on average, you're moving every year. That means you're changing your children's school every year. So it was a social issue for us. We said, if it's a crisis, if the market isn't responding, then the government will. And we committed to getting on and intervening in the market by building ourselves 100,000 homes over 10 years, with 50,000 of them in our biggest city. That was a very bold move. But our view was, we've done this before as a Labour government. When we first started building state housing, we would do it again. The difference was this time it would be for the market, so that first home buyers could purchase a home. We also had no rules that really regulated people offshore who had no interest in New Zealand, who were foreign speculators, from buying in the New Zealand market. That was a real bugbear for people. Look, if you migrate to New Zealand and you want to call it your long-term home, we should be defending your right and ability to buy. But if you have no interest in New Zealand, we decided to draw a line there, and that became something that was of real interest during the election as well. But it was about being ambitious, and it was about challenging the status quo and saying there'll be cases where the market isn't responding, and so we will instead.
Minister, just would like to dig into some of the details of this new densification announcement. Could you just talk us through what this means? Let's say I have a big property in inner city suburb like Grey Lynn, or even in Wellington and Johnsonville, something like that. it's a fairly large section. I have one house on it. I would like to build 2 more dwellings on the property. I don't need resource consent. What do I do? Do I need to approach my council? What's the first step I'd need to go through?
So if you roll forward to next year, when the plan changes to make real what we announced with the National Party earlier this week, when those plans are in effect, we will be enabling a landowner to develop that property to a new level of density. The number of dwellings that can be on an individual site that's subdivided for more will increase according to some rules, and they're essentially an 11-metre maximum height, boundary setbacks of 1 metre at side boundaries and 2.5 metres at the front, maximum site coverage of 50% of the site with buildings, and that will enable more of the sorts of housing that is starting to solve the housing or make a dent in the housing crisis in Auckland.